The Aquest Podcast, Funds Industry Conversations.
Hello, podcast listeners, and welcome to this episode of the Aquest Podcast with me, Danny Lawler. For this episode, I'm joined by Ann Shiels, who is an ESG and sustainability expert. Ann joined me on the podcast about 2 years ago, and I was keen to catch up with her to chat about some of the developments that have been happening in this area in the 2 years since we spoke last. So we had tons of ground to cover, as you can imagine. We talked about the outflows that we've seen from ESG funds over the fourth quarter of 2023 and whether that was a sign that maybe some of the steam had gone out of the ESG brand. We also talked about the regulatory changes. So we've got SFDR 1.5, SFDR 2.0, and then we've got regulations around corporate disclosures and also the rating agencies who issue ESG ratings. They're on the way into the regulatory sphere as well. So tons to talk about on the regulatory side. And we wrap up by chatting about the current Common Supervisory Action, or CSA, which has been undertaken by ESMA and the central bank, where they're going out trying to find out what firms are doing currently when it comes to complying with rules around disclosures and implementation of SFDR. So as I said, tons of ground to cover. And it turns out that lots has been happening in this space in the 2 years since we spoke last. So sit back and enjoy this episode, all dedicated to ESG, my chat with Ann Shiels.
The Aquest Podcast, Funds Industry Conversations.
Hi, Ann. It's great to have you back on the show.
Hi, Danny. Thank you. It's good to be back.
It's been almost 2 years since we had you as a guest on the Aquest Podcast, and a lot has happened in that time in terms of the ESG world and the development of the regulations and I guess how used to it people are getting. But I just wondered, what's your sense of it over the last little while, of the 2 years since we spoke last? Is it as active when you're immersed in it as it seems to be when you're kind of stood on the sidelines?
I think it is. I mean, I can't believe it's been 2 years. A lot has happened. Really, a lot has happened. I think if I listened back to the podcast 2 years ago, I probably would have different views on things now. And a lot of that is down to the fact that, you know, now we see the market practice evolving around things like implementing SFDR, what your disclosures look like, what your periodic reporting looks like, and how you're operationalizing that within your fund management company, within your fund. And so that's SFDR alone, but then the pace, I think, of regulatory change and development has not slowed down at all. If anything, it's picked up because it's kind of finalizing a lot of proposals that came out. And I think if I had to pick one topic that's really under the spotlight at the moment and is a bit of a game changer is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD. Now that UCITS aren't directly in scope of that themselves, but it does have knock-on effects, and just generally for the world of corporate sustainability and financial services, that one's a bit of a game changer.
Yeah, it does sound like it, and we will chat about it in a little bit more detail. And I guess there's nothing that gladdens the heart of financial services businesses more than hearing about not just regulatory change, but more regulatory change and more detail and more expectations being loaded on them.
Yeah.
I wondered, though, I just read a report from Morningstar about in early February. It talked about outflows from ESG funds, and it said that Q4 23 was the first time that there'd been a period of outflows from ESG funds globally, albeit that in Europe there was slight inflows, but at historically low levels. And I just wondered, from your perspective, what's your sense with the ESG world and the ESG fund world? Has some of the steam gone out of it that we're seeing outflows, or are managers and investors still as interested as they were maybe when we chatted 2 years ago?
Yeah, so and that's that Morningstar reports are always, I think, really on the money in terms of what's going on in the market. I think people are getting more. ESG isn't brand new anymore. I think on the understanding of what ESG means, there's still divergence in what people understand it to be. I think that's inevitable because it covers such a broad range of issues. You know, you've got environmental, social, and governance, and there's so many issues in between all of that. So I think there's a bit of sort of settling in the market. I don't know whether in that report they made any comments about the fund outflows being comparable across the market. So in other words, ESG funds, it wasn't any different for any other kind of funds.
Well, in fairness, and I should say, for context, the outflows from ESG funds were less than the outflows from active funds or from ETFs and passive funds. So it's not that ESG funds were alone in it by any stretch. But I guess it's just because we hadn't really seen any kinds of outflows or negative outflows overall that it stood
whether
out.
that's a kind of a trend. Look, I'm not sure. I think where people are getting to is sort of normal commercial rules apply in terms of raising capital and where you're going to put your money. I think ESG is an important factor and will continue to be important for the people that want it to be important. And I think the differentiation is maybe investors want to see it being done well. They're getting more sophisticated maybe about, understanding it being done well. We've more disclosures out there because of SFDR, so people can compare and contrast, which is what the regulation was designed to do. I think when you look at it globally, so Europe obviously really, really strong, and SFDR is mandatory. And, kind of in my view, it's probably the best chance we have of directing capital flows in the funds market anyway to a more sustainable economy and sustainable economic activities. Kind of globally, obviously, it looks different in different regions. So if you look at the US, for example, ESG definitely politicized, definitely, in the culture wars, and you have the likes of BlackRock. So we got very used to Larry Fink coming out with his annual letter, his Dear CEO letter, really ESG front and center, almost taking a step back going, I don't know if we're going to use the term ESG anymore because people have just latched onto it and it's become really politicized. I don't think that means ESG is going away. I just think it needs to be reframed in people's minds and consumers and investors' minds. And there's this talk of a concept of thinking more about rational sustainability. So around sustainability and investing sustainably being around creating long-term value. And I think that's the way to go because that's very hard to argue with. No one can really have an issue with creating long-term value, if you look at it that way. I think different regions are different on it, but I do think the kind of the US view on ESG probably has influenced the market and how you hear ESG and ESG funds popping up and being talked about.
So notwithstanding some outflows, I guess the message is that ESG funds are not going anywhere. They're starting to mature is probably overstating it. They're certainly settling in and becoming part of the suite of products available to investors.
I think that's right. And, if you kind of talk about it from a purist point of view, sort of a purist sustainable finance point of view, you're not going to have ESG and non-ESG funds anymore. Everything should just be investing for long-term value and investing sustainably. So I think, that's kind of the purist view on it. But look, you will always get a range of products out there in the market that will cover everything that is available to invest in. So including the not so sustainable things, but that's life, and that's the economy that we live in.
Yeah, and I guess one of the interesting things from the Morningstar report about the outflows, one of the issues that they picked up on in terms of Europe was that perhaps some of the outflows were due to investors being a little bit confused about the product range or about the regulatory regime. And on the back of that, then, of course, you have the Commission launching a review into SFDR. So you could understand why investors might be confused if a regime that's only about 2 years old is already up for review. I wonder, did the Commission shoot themselves in the foot a little bit by launching SFDR so quickly, relatively speaking, without really having all of the detail of it bedded down? Has it actually done them a bit of harm?
I mean, hard to say. I mean, you're talking to the converted here. I think SFDR, as I've said, is the best chance that we have of directing capital towards more environmentally friendly, socially friendly economic activities. And the fact that it's mandatory in Europe, I do think it's the best chance that we have. So I'd really, really like to see it work. I think it's inevitable that there needed to be some changes as it worked through being implemented by the market, in large part, I think, because it's one regulation covering so many different types of financial market participants and so many different types of financial products. So everything is in there across the financial sector spectrum, from asset management to insurance to managed accounts, pensions, so everything is covered, and it is hard to come up with a one size fits all for that, notwithstanding the fact that you're talking about such a scale of E issues, of S issues and G issues underlying it all. So perhaps, I mean, I'm not sure it was designed to kind of go, right, we'll just get this out there and see how it goes. I don't know if that was the approach, but I think some refinement is inevitable. I think the very strong reaction that has come out from the market is that both on the buy side and the sell side, people are looking for certainty and credibility, and that raises the spectre of, should this have been a labelling type regime?
Mm.
And, that is obviously one of the questions in the European Commission consultation on SFDR. So you mentioned, it's under scrutiny and it's under consultation. So there's actually 3 consultations out there at the moment. You have one on the level 2 SFDR technical standards. That was an ESMA consultation. We got a final report out on that on the 4th of December last year. So I think everyone's kind of calling that SFDR 1.5. So changes to the level 2 disclosures and some more certainty around things like principal adverse indicators, which is good. And then we have kind of SFDR 2.0, which is the European Commission consultation. So that there's 2 consultations embedded in that. So that's why I say there's 3, but one was kind of more consumer focused and one more targeted to stakeholders in the financial market. But broadly speaking, one is just a longer version of the other, actually. So that one is, the interesting things in both of them. So I do agree with what you're saying. People are getting a bit confused, a bit kind of, not fed up, but thinking, right, hang on a second, I've gone and done these disclosures now and they're changing already. Is it worth it? that is a headache, definitely.
Yeah.
If you put in time and resources to making these disclosures and they're changing again, I can see why that is off-putting. But hopefully we will end up, I think, once we're through it all, with something that gives the credibility that the market is looking for, particularly around products. Do we end up with labels? Maybe. If we do, I think you need more than 2. Our Article 8 and 9 Luff, Article 8, is really broad, as we know. So is there something like more than 2 labels? And then obviously with the UK SDR coming out, the FCA came out with their final report on that, with their 4 label categories, even though they're voluntary, not mandatory like SFDR. Obviously it's hard to not to pay attention to that as well.
Yeah, it's sensible to do that. And I think in terms of rushing the regime out, maybe it was the right thing to do, in terms of it's a bit of a pain when you're trying to implement it, but maybe it was right to just get something out there and see how it goes. Because if you were to wait till you've settled every piece of detail, you'd run the risk of never getting anything out. And given the climate emergency, that this is part of a fix, hopefully. Maybe time was of the essence and they just have to do it. But having said that, I think as we get to SFDR 2.0, I think this one does need to be pretty close to the mark, because after that you do run the risk of just turning people off and turning investors off.
I think that's fair.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah.
And in terms of timing then, so obviously SFDR was March 21. That consultation, so the 2.0 consultation was September 23. So again, like really 2.5 years for a major rewrite isn't great, but it is what it is. And that closed in December. So I guess over the course of 24, we should see where the Commission's thinking is at. And that consultation was quite broad. They did throw out a lot of things, like getting rid of 8 or 9 designations and stuff like that. So it'll be interesting to see what they start to settle on.
Yeah, and I think the important thing to remember as well is that consultation is on the level 1 legislation, so SFDR itself, and it is a much longer process to change level 1 legislation than it is to change level 2 legislation. So in reality, when all the dust settles on the consultation and you get a picture of, okay, where we're going on this, then you need to enter into the legislative process. So in reality, when are you going to see a change to SFDR level 1? Are we talking 2028? Are we talking to 2029? Mm-hmm. So I guess in the kind of short to medium term, SFDR, what we have now, amended by SFDR 1.5, is what we have to work with.
And as if that wasn't enough, Anne, there's plenty of other regulatory initiatives and change on the way that also affect this sector, albeit not necessarily SFDR. So you mentioned at the start the Corporate Sustainability Disclosure Regulations, CSDR. Chat a little bit about that and the detail of that and what it's going to mean for the financial services industry or for the funds industry, albeit they're not directly in scope.
Yeah, so Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, as I said, that is consuming an awful lot of time in the sustainability world at the moment in Europe, but more globally as well. And really, so what is that? It is a regime where European companies, now it does have third country reach as well, we won't get into that, really have to report on how their organizations consider environmental issues, social issues, and governance issues from a double materiality perspective, right? And you hear an awful lot of talk about double materiality. And what does that mean? It means requiring companies to disclose information on significant sustainability matters from a financial perspective, an impact perspective, or both. So that's really the game changer piece around CSRD. The other game-changing piece is once this information is reported and it needs to be included in their management reports, limited assurance will be required on it. Okay, so that is making people really sit up and pay attention to their processes around this. So corporates having to produce all this information, and it's kind of a scaled effect. So big entities already reporting under the non-financial reporting directive will be reporting next year, covering this financial year, and then over the next couple of years it'll affect not those massive organizations. There's a trickle down effect. So it really will. Everybody really needs to pay attention to this to see, am I in scope, am I not really at the start. It doesn't apply to UCITS and AIFs. Okay, there's an exemption in there for that, so funds don't need to report. But what I think it does mean, so for those UCITS and AIFs that are investing in these companies that do report under CSRD, the idea is that there should be an awful lot more readily available information around sustainability issues. So for the investment process and flowing through to what you're disclosing under SFDR or how you're calculating your principal adverse impact indicators, for example.
So I guess if we were 5 years down the tracks, looking back when CSDR is settled and SFDR has evolved, this issue about investor confusion ought to be hopefully a little bit resolved in that companies are disclosing more and better quality and more accurately around sustainability, and then investment funds in making their decisions are able to make better decisions because they have better information, and then investors can understand what it is the funds are doing and trust that issues like greenwashing and what have you are being well managed.
Yeah, I mean, that's the idea. Absolutely, that's the idea. It's not perfect, as I said, if you're investing in all US equities, they're not necessarily in scope of CSRD. What you do there are listed, certainly large listed corporates. I think that's going to work for. There will be gaps, but it does affect. If you're in the value chain of a listed corporate, they're going to be asking you questions around these issues as well, so they can report accurately. So it's kind of it's getting the big listed guys to nudge everyone to be able to look at this information so that they can report it.
Yeah, and I guess there's an element here of market discipline playing a role, so that if investors with large amounts of cash to invest ask or demand of companies that they're making these kinds of disclosures, then it's going to push those companies into this, even if the regulations haven't done that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, I guess the other thing in the Irish funds industry or European funds industry to think about with CSRD is if you're a large manco, listed or not, probably worth a look to see, right, am I in scope of this, or how might it influence me? So if the fund vehicles themselves aren't in scope, doesn't necessarily mean that the larger mancos may not need to pay attention to it from a scope perspective.
And as if that wasn't enough, Anne, in terms of regulatory change, we also have rating agencies for ESG ratings starting to come into scope as well, or at least they're in the headlights for regulation.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess just taking a step back when we say ESG rating agencies, where does that fit into the picture? Again, it's probably a service that has been developed to support financial market participants, number one, in making investment decisions, making their sustainable investment decisions. So helping them get the information about the underlying companies so they can build their sustainable investment policy, engagement policies, etc. So to be able to do the portfolio management side of things. The other type of service that they provide is to provide information that ultimately really flows through to SFDR disclosures. So both really valuable services for financial market participants and fund participants. And these ESG rating agencies, I mean, there's tons of them out there in the market, both European based and outside European based. And they've been under the spotlight from regulators for quite a while now, because I guess the there isn't harmonization across how one ESG rating agency might score a particular corporate compared to how another one might do it. So there was an interesting research done into kind of comparing the correlation between how one ESG rating agency might score a particular corporate versus another rating agency. And where you have things like credit ratings, the big market players, and that would correlate, their ratings would correlate to about 0.9. ESG rating agencies, the highest kind of correlation was 0.6 or something like that. So a real divergence. Again, no surprise there, because you're dealing with E issues, S issues, and G issues. One rating agency might weight E more highly for a particular underlying corporate, and another one might rate S really highly for a particular underlying corporate. So you get divergences, and you hear about certain large corporates, global corporates, being dropped out of, the S&P, ESG, they might have, their rating might have gone lower because maybe they were putting more of a focus on their G issues rather than their E issues. Okay, so no comparability really. And as we know, European regulators are really, really keen on transparency, comparability, and harmonization where they can be under the market. So that's kind of the purpose behind looking at ESG ratings. So really strengthening reliability and comparability of ESG ratings. That's kind of by the providers. That's the aim. So under the new rules that are proposed, ESG rating providers would need to be authorised and supervised by ESMA. So they're not currently, and they need to comply with transparency requirements, and particularly with regard to their methodologies and sources of information. Okay, so what is now currently a closed book will need to be more open in terms of what rating agencies are doing.
Yeah, I should say, like, post-financial crisis, one of the many changes was to bring credit rating agencies within the regulatory sphere, and they're, as you said, they're registered and supervised by ESMA. And so I'm guessing that what will happen here will be an extension of that, given that ESMA already knows how to, authorize and supervise credit rating agencies. It will now extend it to ESG rating agencies.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be sensible. So this is really topical at the moment, because I think they're on just on the 5th of February, provisional political agreement between the European Council and the European Parliament was reached. So there's kind of excitement about this at the time of recording, at the time we're recording right now, Danny, around this regulation. That's not the end of the story. It still needs to be approved by the Council and the European Parliament before going through formal adoption, right? That's that legislative process that we talked about. But once it's looking good in terms of support for the proposals. So I think this will be a real thing. And what will that mean then for funds? For the people who use these rating agencies, they're going to have a lot more transparency about how these agencies are calculating the scores that you get, the composite scores that you get for ESG. I think they're introducing the possibility as well of providing separate E and S and G ratings, which I personally think is the way to go. I think that's a clear approach. But if they're providing a single rating, they need to show what the weighting is between the E, the S, and the G factors. So that's going to be information that currently isn't out there in the public domain anyway. I mean, who's a fund client of an ESG rating provider may be able to ask and get that information anyway. But that is all going to be transparent now.
Sounds like more activity and work for the regulatory lawyers, Anne.
It does, doesn't it?
Nothing wrong with that. So let's wrap up then on the CSA, so the Common Supervisory Action that's currently underway in relation to compliance with SFDR disclosures and implementation. So just to spend a moment to talk about common supervisory actions generally, in case anybody's not that familiar with them. So ESMA, the European Securities and Markets Authority in Paris, has a number of jobs. One of them is to complete the single rulebook, and another is to develop and encourage supervisory convergence. So as part of that supervisory convergence mandate, they undertake this work called CSAs, Common Supervisory Actions, where individual regulators will go to ESMA, they'll agree a form of a questionnaire and a topic that they're going to review. Those questionnaires then will be given to the national authorities to go and circulate to their regulated firms to complete. And then they make their way back from the firms to the regulator in Ireland, that's the central bank. Often there'll be follow-up with on-site meetings by the central bank with a selection of those firms that have completed questionnaires. And ultimately, all of that information will be fed back to ESMA, and ESMA will develop a final report that will set out what they've found. And in addition to that, domestically, often the central bank will produce its own Dear CEO letter to give additional feedback. And it wouldn't be unusual if you were a firm that the central bank had visited that you might receive a risk mitigation program, an RMP, identifying what the central bank believes are some weaknesses and how you go about your compliance, for example, and then with a list of to-dos to try and close those gaps. So broadly, that's how the CSA process works. And for SFDR compliance, we've had this since July of last year. That's when ESMA launched this. It's probably going to run through till about the end of this year or even beyond. So where are we at, Anne?
Where are we at? So that's a really, really comprehensive and concise summary of the CSA. So that's exactly what firms can expect from this Common Supervisory Action on CSA. That's the process. And I think firms need to remember that. So my understanding is that not every financial market participant received the original questionnaire on SFDR. So some did. I'd say a lot did. And there is a little bit of there has been back and forth. So there was original responses gone in from the original questionnaire, went back to the central bank. The central bank came back with some more questions. Those questions, I think the deadline for responding to those has passed. And now I think we seem to be in a bit of a holding pattern. Perhaps this SFDR consultations have something to do with this. I don't know. But I think the next stage in the process that you've outlined for SFDR is if any firms will be on the list for an on-site visit. I think that was originally slated to happen perhaps by the end of Q1 this year. So if that's the case, I guess if those on-site visits are going to happen by the end of Q1 this year, I guess firms should be hearing about that. I don't know, Danny, in your experience, they should be hearing about that soon, because I don't think the central bank just doesn't turn up. They let you know.
They get a few weeks' notice to prepare and to agree a date when people are available and that kind of thing. So the logistics. And obviously, if you're in the receiving end, it's a CSA, as opposed to a pure supervisory visit, you'll want to prepare so that you know your materials and you're in a good position to have a fruitful and meaningful engagement with the central bank. And if it does result in a risk mitigation program, which they often do, that it's one that you can cope with, and it's not one that's going to cause the firm a lot of heartache.
Yeah, and so I guess the point to remember with this particular Common Supervisory Action, there were obviously questions around the SFDR disclosures themselves, so at a product level, but also at the firm level, at the entity level, talking about integration of sustainability risks and factors. So, which was a separate piece of legislation, Danny, you'll remember the updates to UCITS and AFMD integrating sustainability risk. Certainly those policies, I think, are in scope. Those policies are in scope for this Common Supervisory Action as well. So it kind of hits it at both product level and both firm level. So, your processes, your policies underlying how you're integrating this into your business are all relevant here as well.
And then in terms of timing, so just to give people a sense, when the last CSA was on asset valuation, so that launched in January 22, ESMA produced their final report in May 23, and the central bank issued a Dear CEO letter just in December. So that took about 2 years from start to finish for a Dear CEO letter. And I guess for this one, broadly, it'll be something similar with the complication of the, as you mentioned, the SFDR review in between.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really useful comparison. Yeah, in terms of overall timing. Yeah.
So we're a little bit away yet, given that this launched in July 23. But at the same time, if you are going to be visited, as I said, it's a good idea just to make sure you're well prepared, and everybody else to keep an eye on what's going on here, because you do get good feedback from the report from ESMA and the Dear CEO letter from Central Bank as to where they're at and what they will expect to see if they will come and visit your firm.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So there we go, and another whistle-stop tour of SFDR.
Yeah. I mean, we could talk about so many other things for sustainable finance regulation, but I think we covered a lot.
It's a lot of ground covered, and I guess whilst maybe it's not just as high-profile a topic as it was maybe when we spoke 2 years ago, when you had things in the interim like lots of chat about the individual accountability framework and that kind of stuff. SFDR and sustainability and ESG is still such an active part of the regulatory environment at the moment for the investment funds industry.
Yeah, definitely. If it's not somewhere on your regulatory change horizon, it should be.
It should be. Listen, thanks very much, Anne. Appreciate your time and your expertise.
My pleasure. Thanks for the conversation.
Thank you, Aquest listeners. We'll catch you the next time on the Aquest Podcast.
The Aquest Podcast, Funds Industry Conversations.